Why were German prisoners punished without anyone touching them, without beatings, without cells, and without orders? And how did something that looked harmless at first slowly break them more effectively than violence ever could? Nothing happened at first, and that was what made it unsettling. The morning unfolded exactly like every other morning in the camp, with the same routine, the same roll call, and the same slow movement of men across the yard. Yet something felt subtly wrong, not because of noise or tension, but because of how ordinary everything appeared while expectations quietly failed to materialize. The prisoners were lined up, counted, and dismissed, and then they were left where they stood, with no further instructions, no shouted commands, and no visible purpose assigned to their presence, as if the day had paused without explanation. Minutes passed, then more. Guards remained at their posts, not watching closely, not intervening, and not addressing the men in any way that suggested correction or urgency, while the prisoners waited for something to happen, unsure whether they were meant to move, speak, or simply remain where they were. No one did anything. The yard filled with silence, broken only by the sound of boots shifting against gravel, the distant hum of camp machinery, and the occasional cough from someone standing too long under the rising sun. Yet even discomfort failed to provoke a reaction from either side. Some prisoners glanced toward the barracks, expecting an order to return inside, while others looked toward the perimeter fence, half expecting a delayed instruction or a sudden change in tone. But nothing came, and the absence of direction began to feel deliberate rather than accidental. A man near the center of the yard took a cautious step forward, then stopped, unsure whether movement itself might be interpreted as a mistake, while others noticed and adjusted their posture slightly, careful not to draw attention without knowing what kind of attention might follow. The guards noticed these small movements and did nothing. No warnings were issued. No corrections were made. Time continued to stretch, losing its usual shape as the men stood without purpose, unable to decide whether waiting was expected or simply tolerated, and the lack of response slowly transformed uncertainty into something heavier. By late morning, fatigue became visible. Some prisoners sat down where they stood, resting their backs against walls or posts, while others remained upright out of habit rather than instruction, their eyes fixed forward, their expressions neutral but strained. Still, nothing happened. No punishment followed the quiet disobedience of sitting. No reaction followed the refusal to return inside. The camp appeared to accept every action and every inaction equally, and that was when unease began to replace confusion, because systems rarely behaved this way without reason. The men began to watch one another more closely than they watched the guards, measuring reactions, searching faces for signs of understanding, and finding none, as if each of them was waiting for someone else to reveal what was expected. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt observant. By midday, hunger set in, and with it irritation, yet even this failed to break the stillness because no one wanted to be the first to test boundaries that had not been defined, and the cost of making the wrong decision felt higher than the discomfort of waiting. The guards continued their routine movements, changing positions, speaking quietly among themselves, and carrying out visible tasks that had nothing to do with the prisoners standing only a short distance away, reinforcing the sense that whatever was happening was not a mistake. It was allowed. As the hours passed, the men began to understand one thing clearly, even if they could not explain it, that they were not being punished in any familiar way, and they were not being instructed either, but were instead being left inside a situation that offered no cues, no structure, and no indication of when it might end. And by the time afternoon shadows stretched across the yard, the realization settled in quietly and without agreement that doing nothing was no longer neutral, because the waiting itself had become the thing they could no longer ignore. As the second day began, The prisoners returned to the yard with the same unresolved expectation lingering in their movements, assuming that the absence of instruction would eventually correct itself. Yet what unfolded before them was not a simple repetition of the previous day, but a version subtly altered, as though the space itself had learned how to continue in silence with greater precision. Roll call proceeded as it always had. Numbers spoken aloud, checked and rechecked with practiced indifference. And then, once again, the guard stepped aside, neither dismissing the men nor directing them anywhere, leaving them standing beneath the open sky with no signal that the moment had concluded. This time, however, the stillness felt arranged rather than accidental. Along the edge of the yard, water containers had been placed in plain view, close enough to be reached without crossing any boundary, yet positioned in a way that made every step toward them feel intentional. And when one prisoner finally moved to drink, no reaction followed, no warning was issued, and no attention was drawn to the act itself. Slowly, others followed, each movement hesitant, each decision weighed more carefully than necessary, until the yard filled once again with men standing, sitting, leaning, and waiting, all under the same calm supervision that refused to clarify whether these actions were permitted, tolerated, or simply irrelevant. The guards moved through their routines without urgency, adjusting equipment, walking familiar paths, exchanging brief words among themselves, never addressing the prisoners directly and never acknowledging the waiting that had come to define the space between them. What unsettled the men most was not the silence, but the sense that the camp had adjusted around it, absorbing the lack of instruction into its structure as though this condition had been anticipated long before anyone noticed it taking shape. Food appeared later in the day, not withheld and not announced, placed at the usual location without ceremony. And when no order came to form lines, hesitation returned, followed by cautious movement, as small groups approached the rations without consequence, further eroding the expectation that routine required permission. With each hour that passed, it became harder to identify which behaviors mattered and which did not, because neither obedience nor restraint produced a response, and the familiar logic of cause and effect no longer applied in a way the men could recognize. Conversation remained minimal, voices kept low, sentences unfinished, not out of fear of being overheard, but from the growing uncertainty over whether speaking itself constituted an action that might later be judged. Fatigue set in earlier than before, not from labor or deprivation, but from a sustained effort of remaining alert in the absence of guidance, of continuously deciding how much movement was too much and how much stillness might be interpreted as weakness. The guards continued to observe without appearing to observe, their presence steady and unremarkable, offering no sign that the waiting would be rewarded or punished, reinforcing only the impression that time itself had become the mechanism through which something unseen was being applied. By the end of the second day, the expectation of an order had faded, yet no one left their place, caught between the fear of acting prematurely and the weight of remaining still, as the camp settled into a form of routine that no one had announced and no one appeared responsible for. And as evening returned and shadows stretched across the yard once more, it became increasingly difficult to believe that this condition was temporary, because the silence had learned how to endure, and the men within it were beginning to feel its effect without yet understanding what it was meant to change. By the third morning, the yard no longer felt like a place awaiting instruction, but rather a space that assumed endurance as its default state, and the prisoners entered it with movements that were slower, more deliberate, as though each step carried the quiet understanding that nothing would arrive to clarify what was expected of them. The air itself seemed heavier, not because it had changed, but because the men had, their posture subtly altered by 2 days of unresolved waiting, their attention divided between the familiar routines of the camp and the growing awareness that those routines were no longer anchored to command or consequence. It was during this prolonged stillness that the first disturbance occurred, not announced by sound or movement, but by absence. One of the prisoners, a man who had been present at roll call and seen standing in his usual place only moments before, was no longer there, and the space he had occupied remained empty in a way that drew the eye without explanation, as though the yard itself resisted acknowledging the gap. At first, no one reacted. Men continued standing, shifting their weight, staring toward the ground or the distant fence line, each assuming that the absence belonged to some instruction they had missed or a correction that did not concern them. Yet as minutes passed and the empty space remained unchanged, attention began to drift toward it with increasing discomfort. The guards did nothing. Roll call numbers had already been verified, and no adjustment was made, no pause introduced, no clarification offered, reinforcing the impression that the disappearance was either intentional or irrelevant, neither of which provided reassurance. Speculation remained unspoken, not suppressed by fear of punishment, but restrained by uncertainty over whether noticing itself carried risk. And so the men watched the empty space while pretending not to see it, each silently measuring how long an absence could persist before it demanded acknowledgement. Hours passed in this state, and the man did not return. Food arrived again without ceremony, placed where it had been the day before, and once more the men approached it cautiously, glancing not toward the guards, but toward the gap left behind, as though expecting it to expand, to claim another place without warning. Fatigue deepened, sharper now than the day before, because the mind strained constantly against the effort of interpreting a system that offered no feedback, and even the smallest decisions began to feel irreversible in a way that could not be rationally explained. As afternoon settled in, another subtle shift occurred, not in the behavior of the guards or the structure of the camp, but within the prisoners themselves, as small adjustments became noticeable, with men unconsciously aligning their movements to match one another, standing closer, sitting in similar positions, as though uniformity might offer protection in the absence of direction. The empty space remained. No name was spoken aloud, no inquiry made, no attempt to account for the missing presence, because doing so would have required acknowledging that something had changed, and no one yet understood what form that change had taken. By the time evening approached, the idea that the man might return had quietly dissolved, replaced by a heavier realization that his absence had not disrupted the system at all, and that whatever governed the camp no longer required completeness to function. As shadows lengthened and the yard darkened once more, the prisoners returned to their quarters without instruction, moving as if guided by an agreement none of them remembered making, leaving behind the empty space that now felt less like an anomaly and more like a warning whose meaning remained deliberately withheld. And in the silence that followed, one thought began to settle among them, not as a question, but as an unease they could not dismiss. Because if someone could disappear without explanation and without consequence, then the absence itself might be the message, and the waiting might no longer be passive, but preparatory. By the fourth day, the change was no longer confined to thought or posture, but had begun to settle quietly into the body itself, where it manifested not as pain or illness, but as a persistent misalignment between effort and result, as though the simplest actions required a level of energy that no longer corresponded to their importance. The men rose more slowly, not because they were exhausted in any conventional sense, but because the act of standing now carried an unspoken question about what would follow, and without an answer to justify the movement, hesitation crept into even the most routine gestures. In the yard, breathing patterns changed. Some men inhaled deeply and held the air longer than necessary, while others exhaled too quickly, as if attempting to rid themselves of something invisible, and the collective rhythm that had once governed their presence dissolved into an irregular cadence shaped by individual uncertainty rather than shared instruction. The guards remained unchanged. They stood in the same positions, moved with the same efficiency, and observed without expression, reinforcing the unsettling impression that whatever was happening among the prisoners existed entirely outside the framework of concern and therefore beyond correction. It was during this prolonged exposure to stillness that physical symptoms began to surface, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore as hands trembled slightly when lifting utensils, legs stiffened during long periods of standing, and eyes struggled to focus on objects that had not moved at all. No one spoke of these changes. To acknowledge them would have been to admit vulnerability in an environment where vulnerability had no defined response. And so the men endured in silence, each privately testing the limits of his own endurance while pretending that nothing had shifted. Food continued to arrive at predictable intervals, yet appetite faded unevenly, with some men eating mechanically while others pushed their portions aside untouched, not out of refusal, but because hunger itself had lost clarity, dulled by the constant effort of waiting for a signal that never came. Sleep offered no refuge. At night, bodies rested while minds remained alert, replaying the day's stillness in fragmented loops, and when morning returned, it felt less like a beginning and more like a continuation of something already underway, unfinished and unacknowledged. The absence from the previous day was never addressed, yet it exerted a growing influence, shaping behavior through implication alone, as men unconsciously avoided standing where the empty space had been, widening the gap as though proximity carried consequence. By afternoon, coordination faltered. Simple tasks required longer pauses, movements lost precision, and the yard took on the appearance of a place occupied by men who were present in form but partially withdrawn in function, their bodies responding to conditions their minds could not define. As evening approached, the realization settled quietly among them that the waiting itself was now altering them in ways that could not be reversed by explanation alone, and that whatever rule governed this silence did not need enforcement, because compliance was emerging naturally, shaped not by fear of punishment, but by the slow erosion of certainty. When darkness fell and the men returned once more to their quarters, they did so with an unfamiliar awareness, because the waiting was no longer something happening around them, but something occurring within them, and the longer it continued, the less recognizable their own reactions became. And somewhere beneath the fatigue and restraint, a more unsettling understanding began to form. Because if the body could be reshaped without force or instruction, then resistance might not require suppression at all, only time. On the fifth morning, the change arrived without announcement, not through words or commands, but through a subtle restoration of form that was so carefully measured it took several moments before anyone trusted it enough to react. The guards gave instructions. They were ordinary instructions, delivered in the same tone that had governed the camp before the silence began, directing the men to move, to line up, to proceed with routines that suddenly felt familiar, almost comforting, as if the previous days had been a temporary lapse rather than a deliberate absence. Movement resumed. Boots scraped against the ground, lines straightened, and the yard filled once more with the predictable geometry of order. Yet beneath this apparent normalcy lingered a tension that no one could quite name, because the men obeyed, not with relief, but with caution, as though each step carried the possibility of another withdrawal. The body responded first. Muscles remembered their roles, posture corrected itself, and breathing fell back into a shared rhythm. But the mind remained detached, observing the return of structure with suspicion rather than gratitude, unwilling to accept that the disruption had ended simply because form had reappeared. Work details resumed, and time began to move again in recognizable increments. Yet the men noticed that their attention fractured more easily now, drifting even as their hands performed familiar tasks, because the certainty that once anchored action had been replaced by an awareness of how quickly it could be removed. The silence of the previous days was never mentioned. No explanation was offered, no acknowledgement made, and this omission transformed the return of order into something more unsettling than the silence itself. Because without context, the men were left to decide whether the absence had been accidental, experimental, or intentional. Some men felt a quiet relief, convincing themselves that the disruption had passed and that routine would reassert its authority, while others sensed that the true change had already occurred and that what had returned was not order, but a reminder of how fragile it truly was. Conversations remained cautious. Words were chosen carefully, voices lowered instinctively, and even laughter, when it surfaced, carried an unfamiliar restraint, as though sound itself had become something that might invite attention. The yard looked the same, the schedules matched memory, and the guards behaved as they always had, yet the men could not escape the feeling that the structure surrounding them was now performative, maintained not to restore balance, but to demonstrate control. By evening, fatigue settled deeper than before. Not the exhaustion of labor, but the weariness that follows prolonged uncertainty. When the mind has been forced to recalibrate its expectations without guidance, and must now operate within a system it no longer fully trusts. As the men returned to their quarters that night, they carried with them a realization that was both quiet and irreversible, because the waiting had taught them something the routine could not erase, and the return of order did not undo the knowledge that compliance could be shaped without resistance, and obedience could be achieved without force. Sleep came unevenly. Some men drifted into rest almost immediately, while others lay awake, listening for changes that might signal another absence, understanding now that stability was no longer guaranteed by consistency, but granted temporarily and withdrawn without warning. And as the camp settled into darkness, one truth became impossible to ignore, because whatever rule governed their lives had revealed itself not through enforcement, but through silence. And once that lesson was learned, no amount of routine could fully restore what had been quietly taken away. When the camp finally returned to what could be called normal, the men understood that nothing essential had been restored, because normality, once interrupted without explanation, never resumes its original shape, even when every visible detail appears unchanged. The routines continued, the schedules held, and the guards maintained their distance with the same detached efficiency as before, yet the prisoners no longer experienced order as something stable, but as something conditional, existing only for as long as it was permitted to exist. What lingered was not fear in its sharpest form, nor relief in any meaningful sense, but a quieter awareness that control did not always require pressure, commands, or punishment, because it could be achieved through absence just as effectively as through force. No one spoke openly about the days when instructions disappeared, yet those days reshaped the way every order was received afterward, because once men had been left to stand, to wait, and to question their own expectations, they no longer obeyed with certainty, but with calculation. The silence had done its work. It had not broken discipline, nor provoked rebellion, nor produced chaos, but instead introduced doubt into a system that depended on predictability, and that doubt, once planted, could not be removed by the simple return of routine. Some men carried the memory lightly, convincing themselves it had been insignificant, while others felt its weight each time they paused before moving, each time they hesitated before assuming the next instruction would arrive as expected. The camp never acknowledged what had occurred, and in doing so, ensure that the unanswered questions remained more powerful than any explanation might have been, because uncertainty does not fade when it is ignored, but deepens when it is left unaddressed. By the time the prisoners eventually left the camp, what they carried with them was not the memory of silence itself, but the understanding of what silence could accomplish, because they had learned that control does not always announce itself, and that the most effective rules are sometimes the ones that are never spoken aloud. And long after the fences were gone, and the uniforms replaced, and the routines forgotten, that lesson remained, quietly shaping how authority was recognized, how order was trusted, and how absence could speak louder than command. Because once men have waited without instruction, they never again assume that structure exists for their benefit, only that it exists for as long as it is allowed to remain. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.